if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And we do three things. We run a daily alternative media outlet. We work to build citizen action networks on the ground in communities. And then we do the broader work of driving collaboration and giving focus and platform to people who are working to build the new socioeconomic political system. So that's us in a nutshell. And I'm going to get out of the way straight away and to introduce tonight Patrick Chalmers, who it's our great honor to host this evening, who's the filmmaker of the film that we're about to see together. Patrick, I think it was Peter McFadyen who first introduced us. So right on the front line of New Democracy. But welcome, and please take your time to introduce your film. Over to you.
Okay, Indra. I think Peter McFadyen is definitely responsible for introducing us, and in the same way that he's responsible for doing a lot of things in his quiet, revolutionary way. Peter McFadyen, who is the author of Flat Pack Democracy, if you haven't come across him, very interesting fellow working from Frome. So, I am a filmmaker. It sort of seems a bit surprising because I don't really think of myself as a filmmaker. I sort of stumbled into making films because I reckoned that that was what was required to talk about the thing that I am somewhat obsessive about, which is the state of our political systems. And I suppose it's been a rumbling realization over, I would say, 20 years that what we call democracy isn't really democracy. And that was a problem for me as a journalist, a written journalist, and it became an increasing problem. And I wrote a book about it and realized that I needed to do more, and eventually came around to this idea of making films as a way of trying to have as much impact on that question of what is democracy as possible, because the problem most certainly hasn't gone away. It seems to have got worse. I want to introduce, before we go into the film, Phil Adams. He is the executive producer of All Hands On. We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Phil. He very generously listened to my madcap scheme in 2017, which was to make films about democracy. He is a wizard of digital marketing, how to do things which for someone my age on the internet are surprising, marvel-inducing, and really for us as a filmmaking operation have allowed us to survive, create an image, create a lot of the blog and the newsletter and clips, and get things together and look as if we know what we're talking about. And obviously, if we don't know what we're looking, if we don't know that we look like what we're talking about, or we don't know it as if we know what we're talking about, it's not Phil's fault. I take full responsibility. So that's Phil. I don't know if Phil will want to say a word now or later in the questions. Round two, Phil. Would you like to? Yes, no? No? Phil's shaking his head. Why did this film get made out of the ruins? It's because I kept coming up against the question, what is democracy? And I kept finding that the academic or the anecdotal descriptions of what democracy is were not satisfying to me. So I thought, well, I'm going to go and ask a Greek. And in fact, I ended up asking quite a few different Greeks and filming what they had to say and bringing the answers back as a film. I can't honestly say I still know that I yet know exactly what democracy is, but I feel more comfortable in the uncertainty than I did before. So I think there are elements of the answer in this film, and that's not all of them, but it's a starting point. So this film is a vehicle for discussion, which means you don't need me talking about it. I'm really chuffed that you're here. Thank you for coming. And this film is a public good as far as I'm concerned. It is made to be used and shared and to prompt discussions about what does democracy mean. That's the idea. I think let's show it, and we can get into the questions and take it from there.
And just briefly, just to say the structure of this evening, after the film is shown, which will take about 30 minutes, Mary Valiakis will be doing a question and answer with Patrick. Mary is a futurist, activist, Imagineer, and runs something called Oi Polloi, which is an amazing space, imagining Greece as the rebirth of the thinking about the future, including democracy and everything else. So that's the way that the evening is going to go. And then after the Q&A, you're all here on an open Zoom space, and you can raise your hands to ask questions. You can do it in the box. You can write your name in the chat room at the side, and we'll monitor the names, and we'll pick you out, and Maria will pick you out for questioning. So with no further ado, and hoping that all my buttons work, I'm about to share the screen, and I'm about to select that bit of my screen, and I'm about to share it with you, and it goes into a big expand, and enjoy the film.
Thanks very much, everyone, and thank you, Pat, for orchestrating that so well. And I'd very much like to. I've got so many questions and thoughts, but I'm really going to be disciplined now and hand over to Mary Valiakis, who is going to interview Patrick Charmer. Mary's one of the co-creators at Alternative UK and the founder of Oi Polloi. Mary, please introduce yourself before you speak, and hand over to you two. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Indra. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Valiakis. I'm a Greek American, and I've set up a social enterprise called Oi Polloi, which aims to reboot Greece as a beacon of civilization. The premise being that, well, besides the heritage that Greece has with being the cradle of civilization, also the fact that the problems of Greece are emblematic of the world's in a globalized world. So, which actually allows me to segue nicely into my questions. Patrick, if you're ready. So as I mentioned, I advocate that Greece can be a crucible for civic innovation on a global scale because, as I mentioned, the problems of Greece are emblematic of the world's. What prompted you to go on this journey to understand the crisis in democracy?
First of all, thanks, Mary, for coming and moderating this. It allowed me to look back at your site, which I've just posted in the chat, and somehow I feel a complete fraud because I feel you should be the one answering the questions. But anyway,
but you're the one who made the film.
It's true. So why go to Greece? It's because I figured that the Greeks were steeped in this history that I, from the north of Scotland, didn't have. And they gave us the word demos kratos. They put it together with democracy, government by the people. It's clear that forms of human government existed before Athens and the city-states, but the ancient Greeks looked very deeply at how politics works. That was the extraordinary work, particularly of Aristotle. You know, as a political scientist 2,500 years ago, he and his students looked at how politics worked and defined it. And I'd started to understand about that because of people have sort of nudged me towards it. And I realized that rather than me as a British person talking about democracy from wherever I happen to be, I thought I needed to go and talk to Greeks and to film Greeks talking about it. And obviously, in the modern sense, Greece has the most extraordinary story of crisis that is still ongoing, even if it's been declared finished. And so, you know, I'm delighted I went because they had a lot to say and a lot to teach me.
Okay. Well, what's interesting about your film, because you met with, you know, people who are refugees and squats, people who are affected by the crisis from all different backgrounds. And your film captures quite nicely how actually do we really live in a democracy, because in Greece, the 2015 results of the referendum were ignored. And today we have a similar thing here, not quite with referendums, but UK government contracts, for instance, going to unqualified parties and so on during COVID. To bring it back to Greece, the Greek financial crisis was precipitated by needing to save French and German banks from crashing since they had underwritten all the Greek debt. So as we'd seen in the referendum, capitalism won out over democracy. And that's why I mentioned today's sort of private interests. How do you see the role that capitalism plays in the erosion of democracy?
So I'll take the last little bit first. How do you see the role of capitalism in the erosion of democracy? So the last word first, democracy. I don't think we live in democracies. So that's my personal position. It's an abuse of the Greek term for government by the people. And the same Aristotle, in his definitions as a political scientist, said, if you want democracy, you use lottery. You use lottery selection, and you get something which is like the criminal juries you have in the UK and some other countries. So we do not live in democracies. We've put sort of nice labels on what we have: representative government, representative democracy. But in the bit of democracy that we all love, you know, in our guts, which is government by the people, we do not live in government by the people. And that's the first thing that for me is critical. We need to stop talking about democracy, and we need to start talking about oligarchy as a precursor to doing something about the catastrophically dysfunctional politics that we are living in, really globally. So let's not sort of beat around the bush. We do not live in a democracy in any sense of the original term, and that's a huge problem. Point finished. What role does capitalism have in democracy? It is primordial. And even if we weren't talking about democracy, but let's say standing back, we're talking about the state of the planet and the collapse of the biosphere and biodiversity collapse, inequality. Capitalism has a huge part to play in that as well. And that's fundamentally the idea of debt-based money. You know, capitalism, like democracy, is a difficult term to define, and we can fight about it for weeks, even lifetimes. But the bit of capitalism that for me is hugely problematic, and I'll put up a link to it, is this notion of debt-based money, which is basically creating money out of thin air. And we've seen that with the COVID crisis. You know, there's been millions, in fact, billions to large enterprises nationally and globally, including fossil fuel companies and airlines and things like that, with absolutely no public input into that process. So capitalism is fundamental, and we do not live in democracies.
I guess interesting juxtaposition in capitalism being, you know, if we can take it to its simplest form, is, you know, the owners of capital, the people who own the means of production, versus democracy is ruled by the people and therefore ruled by the many. So in a way, you could say that real democracy is in direct opposition to capitalism in a way, because the interests of the few couldn't possibly be aligned with the interests of the many. I mean, would you agree?
I don't honestly know, you know, because I'm a capitalist. You know, I have assets. You know, even having a bank account with interest on it makes you a capitalist. So we are like the fish in the water. You know, we don't actually know that we live in water. There are some people on the planet, they're not in the majority, who have absolutely no money. But we are parties to a capitalist system, which is it's a human invention. So we, in our minds, have created capitalism, and we've accepted it, or we're not even aware of it. And in the same way that we've created it, so we can step back, analyze it, and say, we've had enough of this. And that doesn't mean killing people either. It can mean, you know, we can do better than this. And the planet is telling us, you know, the virus is one thing, the COVID is one thing, but any number of other indicators, gross inequalities, mass slavery. There's 40 million people in slavery today. Capitalism is a human construct, massively damaging, and we need to fundamentally change it.
Couldn't agree more. So the philosopher in your film, Alexandros Xismenos, he said, the public space is the space of public interaction, the commercial space, but also the space of ideas where philosophy is born. Philosophy is therefore born around politics, precisely because this process of ruling ourselves brings about big issues. So I think we're seeing public spaces reactivated as catalysts for political discourse, what with tearing down of statues and monuments, and people questioning what symbols we should actually uphold. What do you think might be some outcomes of this upsurge of political activity?
You mean specifically the Black Lives Matter surge of the last few weeks?
Well, for me, the Black Lives Matter and the question of colonial symbols is intimately tied with capitalism, because colonialism is a way of expanding your wealth and using others in kind of utilitarian ways as objects. So for me, capitalism, colonialism, the environmental crisis are all connected. So when people are tearing down monuments of an outdated system, it gives me hope anyway that there will be a conversation in the public sphere about what symbols should we uphold, what should they represent, and maybe get conversation going. So do you have any thoughts on, any outcomes for this new swelling in political activity?
Yeah, I do. I'm white, so it's not the best place for me to be starting to hold forth on racism. But I've written a column today for the people I am doing some work for at the moment, The Correspondent, which is basically talking about my racism and the extent to which declaring my racism is part of my response to Black Lives Matter. And it's complicated and it's sensitive, but the notion of Patrick Chalmers, me, being a racist, is that until I am actively promoting anti-racism, then I am part of the problem. So tearing down a couple of statues is fine by me. There are a hell of a lot of statues that could be torn down, but it's not enough. What about the streets of Paris? I live in France. What about the streets of Belgium? What about the streets of London? What about the streets of Bristol, where the most notorious statue has been torn down so far? The smarter parts of all these places were built with, on the backs of dead people, dead Black people. So a few statues doesn't cut it. So we have this 3 or 4 weeks of sort of uproar, and then it'll all quieten down. But we've had these before. This is not the first time that a Black person has been murdered by the police. And not just in the States, in the UK, in France, where I am as well. So I'm surprising myself by quoting Milton Friedman, but I'm going to, and I'll even put the quote up in the chat. So Milton Friedman talks about having the ideas around at the time of crisis, and this is a time of crisis. In fact, it's a time of multiple crises. And the ideas that I'm interested in and that I would hope to help promote through this film is deep democracy and real democracy. So it's the sort of work you're doing at Oi Polloi, it's the sort of work that Pat and Indra are doing, and Maria at Alternative, and loads of other places that we talk about on our website. So, Black Lives Matter is here, and I'm delighted that, loads of people have started buying anti-racist literature and listening to stuff, but it's just nowhere near enough, and it is going to calm down again. So what I'm interested in is ripping off Milton Friedman's idea and us having the good ideas now in a time of crisis.
Absolutely. How about, when we spoke before, you said you hoped people will understand that democracy is not something someone else is going to do. This was conveyed really well by the lady from the cafe in your film, who said participation and responsibility are essential in self-determination. And yet we have childishly delegated responsibility because we have a representative democracy. How do you think we can encourage others to re-engage and become political adults once again?
Well, I mean, you know, it's not for me to tell other people what to do. I know even with a 17-year-old daughter, that's not a very clever idea within my own household. So I'm not about to tell 30 or more fellow adults what they should do. I can say what I'm going to do. You know, I make films, but I also screen them. And in fact, this screening is the first, and I'm extremely grateful to Indra and Pat and to Maria for making it happen. But it is like, this is a model. And, you know, everyone here who is on this first screening, I make this offer to you, you know, get in touch with us and we'll do it for you. If you want to host a community screening, we'll do it. So how do we become adults? It's by getting off our backsides. You know, politics, democracy is not something that mummy and daddy are going to do for us. It's us, you know. And it's really difficult because we are taught in our schools to obey. That is what our society tells us. Do what you're told. Get good results, follow the exam rules, get a good job, etc., etc. Obey. And we need to disobey. We need to learn to disobey. We need to teach our children to disobey. Our culture needs to be, I'm not sure if you're right. Let's talk about it. You know, rather than, yes, massa, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So on this journey that you've been on in making this film, because I believe there's a few others in the series, is that correct?
That's the delightful hope, obviously. The idea is, Out of the Ruins is like launching this conversation. What is democracy? And here are some really plucky Greeks who know a hell of a lot more about it, frankly, than I do, really. And they're great, great people. You know, I'm British. I think personally the Greeks have a far, far deeper political culture than the British. And I live in France. I think it's also true of the French, but really the Greeks take it a whole level further. Maybe I just mix in the wrong circles when I'm in the UK, it's possible. But so what's next is that, you know, we are looking at, again, the same sort of format, 30 minutes or so, short documentaries, at ideas of radically better democracy. That could be potentially a citizens' assembly in Malawi on MPs' discretionary budgets, so what they can spend in their own constituencies is one possibility with funding more or less in place. It's also in the German-speaking part of Belgium, where they have, get this, a lottery-selected second chamber. Just imagine that. House of Lords, we don't have Sir Bufton Tufton, we have lottery-selected British people, yeah? I'm gonna film them. And then I'm extremely interested, but absolutely unbudgeted, to film V Taiwan. And I spoke the other day to the most extraordinary transgender woman, Audrey Tang, who is Taiwan's digital minister. A spectacular human being, activist, hacker, civil disobedience person who's in government. So those are some of the ideas. It's not easy to get this stuff funded, but you know, it's better than, you know, a lot of the shit that other people have to put up with. So we'll keep going. You know?
Can you talk a little bit about these ideas that you want to explore as examples of nascent democracy or promises of self-governance that you found on this journey?
You know, they're sort of all over the place, actually. That's the extraordinary thing. My main activity, I'm 54, my main professional activity has been journalism, and my cast tend to look for the bad shit. You know, we like to do car crashes and bad stuff. And we don't tend to look for even an explanation of the car crash. I've just started doing some work for The Correspondent, which is a spectacularly good publication. Ad is here, I love them. And it's not just because they give me money. And why do I like The Correspondent? It's because they focus on, there's various different names on it, but solutions journalism. So yes, talk about the problem, but if you're going to, let's talk about some solutions. And as far as radical democratic innovations are concerned, there are tons of them. And I'm sure you could name them as could I, probably everyone else on this call as well. And you know, we don't see much of them on the BBC or anywhere else, frankly, and that's crap, you know? So we need to talk about them ourselves. And that's part of becoming adult. Like if you're not, you know, those conventional media channels, and this is why Donald Trump is so successful, because some of what he says about fake news is true, you know? So we as adults, as wannabe political adults, we need to get a lot more imaginative in terms of where we get our information from. And so go to sites for LGBTQ news, go to sites for patriarchy, what is it? Sexism, what is it? Black Lives Matters, what is it? Go and find out this stuff ourselves, and what do you know? There's some amazing stuff going on, you know? It's like half full, half empty. There is some amazing stuff going on, and to keep ourselves going, because it's not always easy, we need to look for that stuff.
So it's interesting, educating ourselves and dismantling the kind of thought and belief structures that we've been handed down from a colonial capitalist system feels very similar to the process that I've been going through personally anyway, through this Black Lives Matter thing. But it feels like actually hearing Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, talk about, you know, we live in oligarchy with elections. To hear it spoken so simply was a bit of like a smack across the head. And do you, what sort of things do you think we should be educating ourselves with? I know you mentioned a few now, but are there any others that you can hopefully share with us?
You know, what you just quoted from Varoufakis is like a big deal. You know, that's the equivalent of saying, you know, your baby is ugly. It's like, we hold to this idea of democracy as this, like, okay, look, it's not perfect, but it's okay. I mean, look at China, look at Russia, look at, you know, all these other crazies around the world. Let's hold to democracy. And it's like, no, it's not good enough, you know, it's so not good enough. So when, you know, I was delighted to catch Varoufakis. He's a bit of a, you know, he's a bit of a pop star, and he's a politician. So he comes with all the challenges of trying to get him on camera. But I was delighted with his quote, and I deliberately got him to say that. You know, I gave him the Aristotle oligarchy, and he fed it back. And, you know, we need to be able to say we live in oligarchies, and be prepared to say it, and even put it in our questions to our local MPs, to tell our friends. And when they say, oh, Patrick, stop being so bloody revolutionary, would you? You say, look at the facts. We live in an oligarchy. We live in oligarchies. We do not live in democracies. And it's like, okay, what do we do about it?
Yeah. Well, I guess it leads me to my final question. And this is to tie in with Indra and Pat's The Alternative, if politics is broken, what is the alternative? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I do, because sort of politics isn't broken. You know, the politics for me is and it's not just me, I ripped it off from a guy called Bernard Crick, who's a British political scientist. It's basically how we divide the cake. And it's actually how we divide every cake. And the cake could be the right to breathe clean air. The cake could be the right to decent healthcare. The cake could be the right to a basic income that allows you to eat, or it could be access to decent housing. You know, there are all these cakes, and politics basically determines how we divide the cake. So, you know, do we need to fix politics? Most certainly. But, you know, some of politics is actually working. And there are, as we all make active political choices, we contribute to the pool of politics as politics that's working. And as we say to our MPs and our governments, you guys are failing, you know, you're failing not only us, but actually even yourselves. You're failing, you know, have you got kids, for goodness sake? Is this the world you want them to live in? You know, they're human beings as well. They just got the wrong theory of change, which is to get elected and somehow think that's going to fix things. So there are plenty of examples of politics is working. It's unfortunately the most powerful bits aren't working. And somehow we need to tell them to stop it, you know, we need to stop them doing it.
Thank you, Patrick. That was everything from me. I will now hand over to Indra for questions from everyone.
Thanks very much, Mary. And what a great luxury for us to have two people knowledgeable right at the heart of the issue in Greece to be in conversation. So much has come from that. But I'm very aware that the people on this call, there are many, many people here who are active in the work in the field of developing democracy. Some of whom, many of whom we are platforming on the Daily Alternative. So what I'd like to invite now is a combination of either questions for Patrick or Mary, or if you like, to offer your contribution into this space for the new democracy arising. And the way I'd like to invite you to do that, possibly because it's difficult to see everyone at once, if you are ready to make a contribution or ask a question, if you could put your name straight into the chat box now, then you'll have a natural order and I won't miss anybody. So anybody who'd like to ask a question or make a contribution. Candice, if you'd like to unmute yourself, thank you.
Thank you both so much. It's been really phenomenally insightful. But just leading off the back of what you've just said, I wondered if either of you or anybody has come across solutions that actually tackle this oligarchy, I guess, in actually shifting the power balance, because your film was so powerful and moving, where the lady was talking about what sprung out of the overflow of Syntagma, and yeah, that resonated so much just with Occupy and other movements where the people do have this, you know, abundance of ideas and power, and then we see it deplete time and time again. So I wondered if there are any thoughts or strategies of actually solidifying those movements, or creating policies that, you know, shifted the power balance. Yeah.
Do you want to go, Mary?
I mean, I definitely have thoughts on that. I don't know who said the quote, but I love the quote that says, power is not given, it is taken. And I'm not meaning that in any kind of revolutionary sort of way, because a revolution actually doesn't just mean people take up arms. It also means a sort of coming around. That's where the word comes from, a sort of returning, a coming around. So, you know, creating ways and localization and localization projects are ways where people are taking power back and making decisions in their communities locally. And I think that's becoming more and more widespread. It's just, it hasn't caught on as the sort of mainstream way of doing things. And yeah, I think it's just a matter of films like Patrick's, you know, hopefully will bring more awareness to all these kinds of things that are happening around the world. And for me, the power shift doesn't have to be this great big dramatic thing. It can be as simple as, you know, taking ownership of how we grow our food, of how we make our energy, of how we have shelter. It's very simple, mundane things. It doesn't have to be fancy schmancy. It's like the basics of living. And when we don't have those basics covered, that's when we're in this state of fight or flight, which is how I believe the current oligarchy benefits. So looking for those ways where our basic needs can be met and where we are empowered through community decision-making and localization is for me a way of taking back power. And I'll end it there.
Thank you. Patrick, I can't hear you if you want to.
Yeah, I just put a link related to that. I won't say anything on top of that, but it's actually, it's a piece about women leaders during COVID. And so again, you know, to answer Candice's question, it's like, it is happening. So for where we are individually, do it locally, but also don't be downcast, because even in conventional systems, there are some extraordinary stories. So that link that I've just put into the chat, you know, women in the face of COVID is like massively optimistic and encouraging.
I'm just slightly going to break the usual rules and just invite you, Candice, for a minute to talk about what the work that I know you're doing. Just if you could just introduce yourself for a second.
Sure, thank you. Well, over the past 4 years, I've been starting out as a citizen's journey, just exploring how we can, how individually and collectively we can thrive beyond the capitalist structure. And so I've set up a project called Common Unity, looking through the lens of art, how we can mobilize participatory ways of self-organizing and implementing the change we want to see, and looking specifically at the area of the commons as the burgeoning system that will provide that framework for equity and regenerative culture. So we've designed a festival, which is kind of the catalyst for, I like to think of it as where community meetings and I don't know, some kind of political mundanity can come into people's mind. The festival is actually a way to excite people and bring everyone's goods to the table, and just just share ideas and performance, and then actually create some lasting work throughout those days that bring about direct change. So yeah, I'm doing a lot of research at the moment about land being, I guess, the root of the issue. Especially in the UK, that landowners don't pay tax. So there's a large loophole in our system. And again, referencing to the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a lot of reparations that need to be given in order for that community to have sovereignty, particularly in the sense of land. So yeah, I'm in a research phase during COVID lockdown, but thank you, Indra.
Thank you very much. I'm really aware that whenever we open a space, it just reveals more and more. It's like this massive fractal of great creativity that's going on. Jenny, over to you. Jenny. Thank you, Candice. Yeah, could you unmute yourself, Jenny? Thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions, if I may. The first one is, Patrick, do you think the solution then is a lottery-based system? And the second one is, do you think to be effective, decisions need to be delocalized, or rather localized, decentralized as much as possible, so that you end up with smaller groups of people making decisions on questions that affect their lives directly?
Okay, Jenny, thank you. So declaration of interest first. Jenny is, along with Vivian, who's on the call, and Roger, who's left, and David and Sue, who I mentioned at the beginning. Jenny is someone who actually opened her wallet and contributed to this film, and she's on the credits at the end. So obviously my response to her will be colored by that. Not at all. It's actually, I'd want to say thank you to her, actually, and also to those other people I mentioned. So Jenny's question.
Sorry, if I can just say, Patrick, giving the money is the easy bit, doing the work is the hard bit. I'm delighted you're the one doing the work.
Okay, well, thank you for that. But the question, so sortition, is that the heart of the answer? Without hesitation, no. It's potentially part of the answer, and you know, I took part in a crazy Twitter fest yesterday afternoon for a bit. Then I went out into the garden, and Paul was on it. Paul Vittles, who's on the call and has put a question. This idea of whether sortition, so lottery selection, a citizens' assembly, and somehow that produces the sacred result. It's not in any way the be-all and end-all. It can produce results, and it can also be a waste of time. I've seen both. But sortition has some really interesting elements in it. First of all, it gets away from the monopoly of elections. Aristotle, remember, he talked about elections as oligarchy. Sortition gets us much closer to democracy. And why is that? Is because you select a group of people who are far more representative of society than an election will give you. You put them together and talk to them about things like confirmation bias and, you know, why being ignorant is not great. And you get them to deliberate on a specific topic. You get them to come to some sort of consensus, even though they don't need to necessarily agree, and then they make a report. But who designed the process? Who funds the process? What happens after they do it? These are questions that make the sortition element potentially excellent, but also potentially just a fig leaf for the status quo? It's a very controversial question that you've put, Jenny. It's an extremely good question. One of the films we've done is about the Irish using sortition for abortion. And I think in that circumstance, combination of skill and luck, it worked, but it's not obligatory. The second question was relocal. Is that the answer? My short answer would be it's part of the answer. You know, the issues we face are from the local to the global. If you look at something like biodiversity loss and climate change, it's definitely global. Migration, definitely global. Capitalism, definitely global. Colonialism and ideas of reparation, definitely minority world, majority world. But there is an awful lot that we can do locally. Indra and Pat have talked about neighbocracy on the alternative website, which is the idea that you basically have a government system with your neighbors. It's a great idea. You walk to your politics, you know, you get on your bike to your politics. And that deals with health, it deals with food, it deals with accommodation, it deals with mental health as well, it deals with local transport, agriculture, all sorts of things, food provision. So the answer is a bit of both.
Thank you.
And I would say obviously that through the local you can go right up to the global through systems of sociocracy and so on. I know that we've also got Tom Ackley on the call, and Tom, I'm going to invite you if you like to address some of this issue too, because I know that you're an expert in this, and you are going to address, I think, one of the questions that's in the chat box from Paul. Anyway, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit to the people here? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tom Atlee. I'm in Eugene, Oregon at the moment. I founded the Co-Intelligence Institute and the Wise Democracy Project that has a pattern language associated with it. But I was interested in the tension that's been described in Paul's question about, you know, mass participation versus sortition, which is picking a subset of the people and giving them the power and opportunity to deliberate on the subject. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that these are not mutually exclusive. I see the value. I know this. I study lots of different processes of decision-making and conversational deliberative processes, and there's lots of different qualities of process. You can have processes that are really crappy, and you can have processes that generate collective wisdom, and it takes some attention to do the high quality processes, and you can't do that with an entire population. But that's one of the main reasons to do sortition for me, is you can invest resources, quality facilitation, quality information, whatever, into a group of people who are selected to represent the larger population and help them come to higher quality decisions. But around them, there's lots of things you can do. You could have the, you know, people's assemblies, you're going to have world cafes, you have open space, you have all sorts of different activities around that can involve as many people as you want, no limit to that. And they can provide input into the randomly selected group, the what's called mini public, for the mini public to consider as part of their, because they are, everybody is the people, you know, the randomly selected people are the people are out there participating in all these different things. So if you had 30 different conversations that covered 10,000 people going on all around the city, for example, some large city, London or whatever, and then you had people participate in an online thing where they put, there's a thing called Paulis, which can allow people to put in what their input they think is most important, and to evaluate things that other people have said about it. So there's this kind of digestion of the mass public participation going on. It's like it's better than a survey, but has certain qualities like a survey. And then the results of all that can be given to these randomly selected people, saying, these are what your fellow citizens were thinking about. Take that into account along with all the other information that you have. And whatever the group, the mini public comes up with, the randomly selected group comes up with, that can be fed out into conversations again. You know, you could also have live chatting going on while the discussion is being broadcast. There's so many ways to engage large numbers of people, but to have this small group who, if they're authentically randomly selected, will both it's not even represent, they're not representing the community, they're embodying the community in a smaller group of people. And there was in Athens, in ancient Athens, they had a boule, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, which is 500 randomly selected people serving for a year, who were kind of like a legislature, but they had lots of different functions. But one of their functions was to create proposals that were then discussed in the assembly. And the assembly had thousands of people in it. So not to present this as something that is a dichotomy, that you need to do one or the other and say it's really bad if we do this or we do that, but how can we creatively engage both of these modes and together in ways that are create synergies. It's bigger, it's more potential there than there was if we did either of the other ones.
That's excellent. Thanks very much, Tom. I mean, I think we're certainly living in an age where so much more is possible than even 5 or 10 years ago. Ewan, can I invite you to put your question?
Thanks, Indra. Yeah, it was kind of building on Candice and her excellent work, actually, and question as well. But I think it's been expanded and added to by so much richness ever since. I think my fundamental question is slightly moved on a little bit in how do we encapsulate this, the kind of change you're talking about, whilst the rest of society lives in a capitalist structure. Because it's true to say that so many people will respond to many of these opportunities for democracy with, I don't have time. The reason they don't have time is because they are literally feeding the beast and engaged in work that they have to do to continue to pay the bills. You know, what are the kind of micro steps? I guess this is one really for Mary, Patrick, Candice and Tom. You know, what are the micro steps required? I put up an example in the chat there of a business in Sweden, a small consulting business that operates without a leader, it has no chief executive, because they said, actually, we realized we don't need that. And they operate in a way that works by decision-making, very much actually in the way that Patrick's film highlighted, which I thought was really interesting. And that seems to work quite effectively and quite efficiently on a small scale. So that business is 30 people. But I'm also reminded of a story of Zappos, which was shoes and clothes retailer owned by Amazon, which attempted a similar thing 6 or 7 years ago. I think they called it holocracy. And, you know, 20% of the staff left because, as you know, the chief exec said at the time, well, it turns out self-management isn't for everyone. In other words, people struggled to take that responsibility because they kind of didn't know how. So anyway, there's a lot in there, but what are the micro steps that you guys see as the important ones for moving the whole of society forward? Because you can't just move one bit forward. You can't just say, well, we're going to rip down the politics and rebuild that, because if the rest of society isn't married up with that, the whole thing fails. Anyway, sorry, bit of a big question at the end.
Huge question, but you asked for tiny steps, and perhaps Patrick and Mary and even Tom could offer one tiny step each, or some picture of where to find the tiny steps.
Well, I'm unmuted. Tom's chewing, I can see at the moment, so I'll let him finish his mouthful. Tiny steps. From my own point of view, is be nice to yourself. You know, because if you are not in a place where you can do stuff and keep doing stuff, then you'll burn out really quickly. So don't go crazy would be the first thing. Secondly, obviously it's not for me to tell anyone what they should do, but I can tell you what I've done over a little while. You know, I am naturally stingy. We Scottish people have a slight reputation for that. I have no idea where it comes from, but for me, it's encouraging my inner stingy. Stop buying crap. And if you don't buy crap, and let's face it, there's tons of crap around to buy, you don't have to work so hard, you know, to make a living. And if you don't have to work so hard, you can suddenly open up space for other stuff. So, you know, I think all of us are guilty at times of buying crap, or buying expensive coffees, or buying stuff that we don't really need to do. I make my own sandwiches when I go out. You know, I use public transport. My cars are crap. I have two because I live in the country, and my wife and I sometimes have to do independent journeys. But I'm unembarrassed by my crap cars, and I'm unembarrassed by my sandwiches. I save money and I work less as a result on paid gigs, which means that I've got more time to do this stuff, which frankly is the only stuff that matters. You know, we are facing an existential crisis right now on climate change. I've been watching it for 30 years, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. As bad, in fact, worse than they said 30 years ago. So micro steps, yes, be nice to yourself, do stuff at your level, but dream massive and make friends with your neighbors.
I could jump in on the dream massive side of things, because a bit like Patrick, by the way, I'll also endorse all the things that he said too, because without being free from, I call it fight or flight, but you know, without having that burden of the sort of the system that we currently live in, then you're not free to look for the opportunities to innovate and to contribute. So that's a big one. But on the dream big side of things and the small steps, for me, it's really about the story. And that's why I love things that Patrick is, things like this that Patrick is doing, that's showing us there are other ways, there's people innovating in this space. And when I say story, I feel that's why I got into this work that I am doing, is because we live, sometimes people blame postmodernism for the situation that we're in, that we have all these competing narratives and we don't know what to believe and everything is valid, but actually it's just a consequence of the world we live in. We have technology, we have social media, everyone has a voice. And so who's right, who's truth, who's history, right? So that's why I was excited also by the statement in the film about public spaces reigniting this sort of political conversation, because it can get us to think again, okay, so what do we want our societies to be about? And so maybe through these crises, we will start to find an identity and a story that we want to believe in. And so for me, small steps, well, I think the dreaming big is really important. And what I propose to people is connecting the dots between, you know, these movements of change that are happening. Just like how Patrick is doing, and to show that, look, once you connect the dots, you start to see these constellations, and you start to see that the change that we all agonize over is actually already happening. It just doesn't make the news. So I would say educate yourself. I would say look in unusual places. The Alternative is a really fantastic place because they cover, they're like in the thick of it. So, and then you'll start to see that actually what we see in the news is the death of the old system, the existing system, the one that isn't working, the one that benefits the few, not the many. So yeah, and that's what motivated me when I realized that story and narrative can be really powerful, because it's what we believe in, what we choose to believe in. And if we can replace our belief systems with ones that are more in harmony with the state of the world, I think then you'll start to see really big change.
Thanks very much, Mary. And I see now that we're just approaching 6:30, and I have had a little private chat with Alison, who's been waiting to put her question, but she's happy to leave it for now. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. I would say modestly that one of the small steps you could take would be to go and join thealternative.org.uk, because we're platforming the work of so many of the people here today, and we're directly asking the questions that many of you are asking, which is, how do we respond to this time? And the the constant news is that there are many ways to respond to this time: practical, philosophical, theoretical, visceral ways to respond to this time, and we'd be very happy to meet you in that place and share the work of the people here with you on a daily basis. So once again, thanks so much, Patrick and Mary, and to all of you for turning up here tonight, to Pat for actually making the film visible, Maria for producing our events as she always does. Look forward to seeing you again. Thank you and good night.